My name is Robert Huddleston, and I am a sophomore in computer engineering at the University of Michigan. Next month, I will deliver my third completed satellite. Let me tell you how I got here. Although I've always been interested in space, my story begins fairly recently. 4 years ago, I launched a rocket in a model rocketry competition in Northern Virginia. Although there was nothing special about that particular launch, I still remember the excitement of watching my first rocket take off. From there, I knew I needed to go bigger. I progressed rapidly from that first rocket launch to a mile-high launch the next year. 3 years ago, I designed and built the scientific payload for a slightly larger rocket, which we launched from Huntsville, Alabama. The payload was a set of cameras, one of which I modified to take infrared photos. I wired both cameras to a microcontroller and accelerometer for automatic picture taking. I then used the images to form a composite from which we could gather data about the surrounding farmland. 2 years ago, I once again returned to Huntsville, this time as a project manager, to launch a rocket from which we would deploy a semi-autonomous UAV. That was my senior year of high school, and it was also the year where we began a far more challenging project. At the beginning of the year, I took over as a systems engineer and primary software developer for the first ever high school satellite. Although fairly basic, even by CubeSat standards, it was a difficult project and had to undergo rigorous testing before flight. I spent my weekends in labs running vibe and thermal testing, calibrating radios, and testing antenna release systems. 1 year ago, it all paid off when I stood in a field on Wallops Island in late November and watched as our satellite was launched into orbit on board a Minotaur 1. Although it was impossible to adequately describe the mix of excitement, awe, and relief that I felt that night, I know there is nothing quite as inspiring as space. In March of this year, I joined the Michigan Exploration Laboratory as a software developer, working on a CubeSat called Griffix. It was a far more complex project, and I decided to work in the lab full-time over the summer. I developed code, primarily in C++ and Bash, and tested it in the embedded Linux environment of the CubeSat. One of the major projects I worked on over the summer was to completely rewrite the communication system software, which consisted of a physical radio transceiver, a master radio process, and several client processes with configuration scripts. Most of the client processes existed in some form, so I designed the inter-process communication protocols and wrote the master process to interface with and control them. After designing, writing, and eventually debugging the code, I spent several days rigorously testing the new system to ensure it would be reliable on orbit. At the end of the summer, we delivered Griffix for integration. I learned a lot about software over the summer, but I also learned a lot about working in a collaborative lab environment. It can be easy to focus on just one aspect of a project and lose track of the final goal. When we delivered the satellite, it was clear how much interdependence there was between each team. I took over as the lead software developer for the lab as we began work on our next mission called Cadre. My first goal as lead was to reconfigure the outdated compilation system we had used for the previous missions. Although the previous system had been acceptable, it was disorganized and did not have flexibility to meet requirements of the more complex Cadre system. I restructured the flight software to allow for intuitive use, multiple configurations, and integrated testing. The new compilation system is also critical for the addition of our attitude control system and an experimental S-band radio that we will be testing on the next flight. I am currently writing the software that interfaces the S-band radio on board Cadre, which will fly early next year. I look forward to continuing my work here at Michigan, and would love to have the opportunity to contribute to the amazing projects that SpaceX is working on. Thank you for taking the time to consider me as a candidate, and please don't hesitate to contact me for any additional